Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Diana Larsen. I'm Assistant Director for Exhibition Design, Collections Management, and Curatorial Affairs. I'd like to welcome you to the virtual McMullen Museum and to our Into the Collection series, focused on aspects of our permanent collection, which usually takes place live in the museum. This is our second virtual presentation, and we are happy to have so many of you join us today. The McMullen Museum's permanent collection is used for teaching in various disciplines at Boston College and is accessible to scholars for research by appointment. A museum studies course taught by our director, Nancy Netzer, has had students prepare hypothetical exhibitions featuring pieces from the collection, including several of the selections featured today. In this case, we are looking specifically at the museum's paintings by New England artists, several of which have been put on display in the adjoining conference spaces. The McMullen Museum has a number of fine 19th and 20th century paintings by artists based in Boston, New Hampshire, Maine, and Rhode Island. And tonight, we will examine 5 of these in brief presentations with questions at the end. I will start, followed by 4 of the museum's 2021 student ambassadors, undergraduates who work at the museum during the semester in various capacities. We are fortunate to have members of the Student Ambassadors Collections Committee here to speak with you about paintings they have each selected. You will hear from Ethan Starr, Peyton Wilson, Matthew Di Benedetto, and Chris Rizzo. And for future events at the museum, I encourage you all to consult our events calendar on the museum's website. Just working out my screen share thing here. All right. I will begin today's presentation with an oil painting by Boston painter Philip Leslie Hale, entitled In the Garden, painted in the early 1900s, and donated to Boston College in 2018 by Newton College alumna Jane Frances Welch Cronin and Daniel A. Cronin Jr. Painter Philip Leslie Hale was one of the leaders of the Boston School, along with Edmund Tarbell and Frank Benson, and an influential art teacher, writer, and critic. Hale was born into a distinguished Boston family in 1865. His father, Reverend Edward Everett Hale, was a respected clergyman, writer, and social reformer who insisted that his son succeed in passing the Harvard entrance exams in the family tradition before allowing him to pursue his art studies. Both his aunt, Susan Hale, and his older sister, Ellen Day Hale, were painters who encouraged his artistic interests. Hale enrolled at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts School in 1883 and studied there with a young Edmund Tarbell. In 1884, he continued his studies at the Art Students League in New York City. In 1887, like many of his contemporaries, Hale went to Paris to further his academic art training. He attended both the private Académie Julian under the academic painter Jules-Joseph Lefebvre, who taught many American artists among his 1,500 plus students, and Orientalist Gustave Boulanger, as well as the official École des Beaux-Arts. Between 1888 and 1892, Hale spent almost every summer at Giverny in rural Normandy with his good friend, artist Theodore Earle Butler, who was Claude Monet's son-in-law. Hale got to know the French painter through this connection. Showing Monet's influence, Hale's paintings exhibit the characteristic bright light and broken brushwork of French Impressionism, as well as plein air subject matter. This kind of Impressionist painting here by Caillebotte shows the type of things that many American artists studying in Paris would have seen. But Hale also incorporated symbolist and post-impressionist tendencies into his paintings, creating images of decorative beauty rather than description. mysterious figural compositions bathed in light, using a juxtaposition of dots or strokes of color to create a shimmering effect. Our painting shares some of these characteristics. This is a painting by Vincent van Gogh and Georges Seurat, which show this effect that I'm describing. And this is our painting where you can see some of the similar treatment. Hale returned to the United States and exhibited his work in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago before going back to France in the fall of 1890, where he remained for an additional 2 years. In 1892, he settled back in Boston, becoming an instructor of antique and life drawing at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in 1893. He continued a demanding exhibition schedule throughout his life. To set the scene, when Hale returned home in the 1890s, Boston had become a vital center for collecting and appreciating French painting, thanks in a large part to painter William Morris Hunt, who studied in Paris in the mid-19th century and befriended Jean-François Millet and several of the Barbizon school of painters. Hunt encouraged subsequent fellow artists to study in France and abroad and influenced Bostonians' taste for collecting French painting, mostly landscapes. The Impressionists had gained a strong foothold here in the 1870s, with many exhibitions taking place through the 1890s. The Museum of Fine Arts was the first American museum to hold a Monet retrospective in 1911. Artists of the Boston School were deeply influenced by this craze for French art and worked in a similar style, depicting scintillating outdoor settings or domestic interiors. In 1902, Hale married the comparatively more conservative figure painter Lillian Westcott, and the couple shared adjoining studios in the Fenway. Lillian influenced Hale's move away from his more adventurous practices of the 1890s toward a more acceptable impressionist style images of genteel women in garden settings. During his time abroad, Hale began his career as a writer, as an art writer, and on his return to Boston, became an active critic and scholar. He wrote about the contemporary Boston art scene for newspapers and periodicals, and penned several books on art and art history. In 1913, Hale published the first monograph in the United States of 17th century Dutch painter Johannes Vermeer, whose quietly harmonious domestic interiors were prized in Boston. He was responsible for the Dutch painter's influence on the Boston School of Painters, like Edmund Tarbell, his teacher, and his own wife. Here we see Vermeer's concert, sadly stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in 1990, which would have been known by the Hales and other Boston School artists, their Fenway studios being close by. Lillian Westcott Hale's L'Édition de Luxe at the Museum of Fine Arts shares with Vermeer a luminous interior lit through windows, a geometric composition, and figures in artistic pursuits. In addition to painting and instructing at the museum school, Hale taught art history classes at Boston University, lectured at the Boston and Metropolitan Art Museums, and gave studio classes at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He received many prizes and awards throughout his life and was active on the Boston art scene until his sudden death in 1931 at the age of 66. Hale's painting in the garden exemplifies the growing popularity of gardening as a middle-class leisure pursuit at the turn of the 20th century. Industrialization had given rise to this hobby as an antidote to urban life. The increase of immigrant communities in American cities caused an exodus of these middle classes to the suburbs and also prompted activist movements to protect native species of birds and flowers. Replacing the formality of the Gilded Age, the American colonial or wild garden became all the rage. there was an increase of house and garden publications, and the commercial distribution of plants caused a true garden movement. Landscape architecture had also become a viable profession in the 1880s. Artists, like painters, sculptors, and stained glass designers, were professionalized in this period and became active members of the aspiring middle class that pioneered this garden movement. Many had traveled to or studied in France and were very familiar with the French countryside, places like Giverny and the public parks of Paris, depicted in so many French Impressionist paintings, which they emulated in America. Lee Merritt, a traditional academic painter, published an artist's garden, Tended, Painted, Described, in 1908, which expressed an impressionistic aesthetic. Poet Celia Thaxter, a horticultural leader whose main island garden was chronicled in paint by Boston artist Childe Hassam, is seen here in this dreamy, sun-drenched portrait. The Hales owned 2 houses with gardens, one in Rhode Island, shown here, and one in the Boston suburb of Dedham, shown in the painting to the right. An assortment of flowers were popular for gardeners around the turn of the century, such as delphiniums, foxgloves, snapdragons, sweet peas on trellises, irises, lilies, poppies, and varieties of roses. One of Hale's most well-known paintings, the Crimson Rambler, purchased in 1909 by the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts following an exhibition, shows one of the first commercially successful hybridized roses available, whose name is the title of the picture. A faculty member there, Hale played a critical role in introducing Impressionism to Philadelphia. The Hale's daughter, Nancy, has identified the sitter as their mutual friend, Rose Zeffler, also seen in the earlier work I showed by Lillian Westcott Hale. The McMullen's painting, In the Garden, is also likely set in the Dedham Garden. The photographic study by Hale for the 1914 painting Sunbath shows a trellis and a very similar urn to the one in our painting. Standing next to the urn is the decorative figure of a woman in a thoughtful position. Although sketchy, we can see that she wears a protective hat and veil. Hale's teacher and colleague Edmund Tarbell's painting, The Blue Veil, clearly shows a woman with a similar head covering, a fashionable straw hat draped in a translucent sun-shielding veil. Here are some details of our painting, which show Hale's very free brushwork, creating bright sunlight and shadows, and his use of subtle colors to create a dazzling effect. Thank you. So now I have to get out of here. Oh yeah, okay. Here we go.
Thank you, Mr. Matt, for the PowerPoint. Now, some of you might have been at the last Into the Collection event we hosted on September 24th, focused on various maritime painters represented within the McMullen Museum's collections. Those attendees will recognize the painting I'll be presenting today, The Custom House Long Wharf by Arthur Clifton Goodwin, which I'll contextualize within his career and within the McMullen Museum collections at large. My name is Ethan Starr. I'm a senior here and a student ambassador, like the others. Because we decided to present Boston artists this semester, and because I feel this is among the most impressive locally representative paintings we have in the collection, I thought I'd revisit the work for today. Luckily, there are some new findings regarding the work that I can present as well. The 36 by 40 inch undated oil painting entered the museum collections in 1991 as a gift of Harry and Ruth Kozel. Dr. Harry Kozel achieved national notoriety as a neurologist with a career involving psychiatric evaluations in conjunction with multiple high-profile criminal trials, such as those of heiress Patty Hearst and Albert DeSalvo, better known as the Boston Strangler. Dr. Kozel died in 2008, 2 years after his wife Ruth. Now the painting here. Goodwin remains an often overlooked painter, but he is a skillful interpreter of the Boston scene. Somewhat of a self-taught artist, Goodwin was mentored by the local pastel artist Louis Kronberg, better known for his influential teaching career and frequent depiction of ballet dancers in essentially the same manner of Degas. Goodwin seems to revel in the opportunity to capture the contemporary urban scene of his hometown Boston, a subject he approached continually in both oil and pastel over the years. Stylistically, his adherence to plein air painting, varied brushstrokes, and especially in this case, vivid coloration earn him the comparisons not only to contemporary American Impressionists, but to the Ashcan school as well. In fact, there is a good chance he would have been acquainted on a personal level with figures from each community, like Maurice Prendergast and George Lux, around whom he lived when residing in New York City and Old Chatham, New York, respectively. Art historians do not generally consider Goodwin as included or associated with the Boston school of his local contemporaries, perhaps resulting from his lack of academic training in educational centers like Paris or Philadelphia. Unfortunately for Goodwin, perhaps, the notoriety he achieved during his lifespan was limited. He had several instances of his work exhibited at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, the Corcoran Gallery, and even the Museum of Fine Arts on one occasion. While an active artist and teacher locally and a member of the Guild of Boston Artists, the president of which at the time was Frank Weston Benson, who was also represented within McMullen Museum collections, and a member as well of the Boston Society of Watercolor Painters, Goodwin never lived to experience a major museum put on a retrospective show dedicated to his work. Only two have occurred since his death, one in 1946 at the Addison Gallery in Andover, and more recently, the MFA in 1974. I was able to get a hold of two exhibition books since our last Into the Collection, one from the Addison Gallery show in 1946 and another from a show at the Wildenstein Gallery in New York the following year. Goodwin, it seems, loved to anchor his paintings with a tall building, a steeple, or a ship's mast, dividing the canvas roughly in half. For this purpose, the Boston Custom Tower works excellently, and he returns to the structure continually during the period he resides in Boston until he moved to New York in 1921. In April 1915, I found, after consulting our museum files, Goodwin exhibited 18 works, all of related subjects at Dahl and Richards Gallery in Boston. The exhibition, entitled The Custom House Tower from Different Points of View, can we see the next slide, Matt? Showcased studies of the new landmark from a variety of locales in and around the city, including the Public Garden, State Street, East Boston, Charlestown, and Cambridge. The Boston College picture was one of 4 compositions in the exhibition that Goodwin had executed from Long Wharf on the north end. A careful examination of various auction records and museum collections yields at least 6 more color images of paintings by Goodwin incorporating the Customs Tower. Beyond the McMullens, the Custom House, Long Wharf, the artist does return to Boston for a brief period beginning in 1928, after the breakup of his marriage and just preceding his death. It can be surmised, therefore, that most of these undated paintings would have been from the earlier period of his Boston habitation when he remained at the peak of his career. Can we get to the next slide? Located at 3 McKinley Square, the Custom House Tower was Boston's first skyscraper and for many years its tallest structure. The original building was constructed from 1837 to 1847, designed by Emmy Burnham Young in the Greek Revival style and fashioned with a dome. Peabody and Stearns erected the tower atop the pre-existing structure from 1913 to 1915. Boston's growth in the vertical direction, however, had been stunted by a 125-foot limit on any buildings, The custom house was only able to skirt these requirements because it was a federally owned structure. While his choices of subject matter may seem a bit repetitive at times, could we go to the next slide? Goodwin remains remarkably versatile in some aspects of his characteristically improvisational landscapes. His palette can range from the light pastels found in this 1904 piece from the Museum of Fine Arts to the darker, more brooding renderings of Boston's wharfs at night, in many ways resemblant of William Glackens's painting of sailboats on display at the McMullen Museum's adjoining conference center. An exploration of Goodwin's oeuvre reveals street scenes in the style of Child Hussam, as well as nocturnes and seascapes a la Whistler. Among the most striking visual characteristics of the McMullen's painting, however, is Goodwin's polychromatic palette, present in many of his daytime urban scenes in the 19-teens and 20s, perhaps one factor contributing toward the enduring popularity of his landscapes among private collectors in the Northeast United States. Goodwin's work is also represented in the collections of a number of peer college art museums like Colby College, Smith College, and the Harvard Art Museums, as well as larger institutions like the Minneapolis Institute of Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, meanwhile, maintains the largest public collection of the artist's paintings. In other words, the local artistic community retains more than adequate resources for mounting further studies of Goodwin's career, and hopefully further recognition for the artist lies in the not too distant future. To finish, I'd like to read a statement from Giovanni Castano, a painter and art dealer from Boston, which appeared in the 1947 retrospective exhibition booklet as the preface. In our time of over-intellectualization and abstraction, spontaneity, warmth, and charm are becoming rare talents, or rare values, sorry. It is in these qualities one finds in the work of Arthur C. Goodwin. His painting was known only to a small circle of friends and admirers. He did not live, nor did he paint to create a sensation, yet he is one of the great American impressionists par excellence. His poetic nature felt deeply the change of atmosphere, the play of light. His numerous views of the streets, of the parks, of the people of New York and Boston are sensitive, colorful, and highly personal interpretations. Lionel Venturi calls him the forgotten man. He is well remembered, however, by those who enjoyed the privilege of the painter's friendship, and it is a most gratifying experience for one who, at an early date, had introduced Goodwin's art to the public, to witness today a comprehensive show of the artist's work. That's all I'll have, and I think we'll move on to, well, I don't know who next. Okay.
Hi, it's me next. My name is Peyton Wilson, and I'm also a student ambassador, and I'm co-chair of the Collections Management Committee with Matthew and Ethan. And another one of our committee members, Chris, is here. So we are really excited. And I am particularly excited to be presenting this painting by Jay Anaking, who was a Boston-based painter, originally born in Ohio, actually. So maybe not New England through and through, but the most of his life was spent in Europe and in New England. And so I'm particularly intrigued by this painting, and I chose it because I think it's an academically challenging diamond in the rough that the McMullen Museum has. And so I had a really fun time digging into it a little bit more. And so this piece is uniquely situated to provide a starting point for art historians to trace the impact of European schools and specifically French Impressionism on American artists in the 19th century. And so Anaking worked and lived in Europe for a few years, and it heavily impacted his later work. But he would disagree with us calling him an impressionist, which I think is a bit comical, and I'll discuss that here in a minute. But he was a Bostonian through and through. He cared about his city a lot, and it is reflected in his art. So this piece was actually done before his time in Europe, and so I think that's a really interesting starting point as we look at it a little bit more. So he was born in Ohio in 1841. He went to Mount St. Mary's College, but he left to join the Union Army. He was wounded and moved to New York City for a little bit, and then moved to Boston, where he studied lithography and industrial drawing. He had a tinware business that failed, fortunately for us, because he started painting full-time in the 1860s. And he focused on painting landscapes in the Hyde Park area, which, if you're not familiar with the Boston area, that's just south of where we are in Chestnut Hill at Boston College. He used this money from painting landscapes of the Hyde Park area to move to Europe with his wife in 1872. This painting was, as you can see, a vertical landscape, which is very daring and very unusual and more dramatic than your typical horizontal landscape that you'll see. It's especially important because we know that he painted and sketched in plein air, and then actually painted his compositions later. And so it's probable that the sketches he drew in the Adirondack on the way to Boston inspired this. In Europe, you can go ahead to the next slide, Matt. He spent the first 6 months studying in Munich at the Akademie der Bildenden Künste in München, or the Royal Academy of Arts in Munich. So as you can see, this is a painting that he probably would have seen in Munich by Eduard Schleich the Elder. And he emphasized dark, rich colors and the impasto technique, which is thick dabs of paint put on with broad, loose brush strokes, and it creates that rugged texture that you saw on the previous painting. He also studied in Venice, Switzerland, Germany, again, Austria, Holland, and Paris. And if you want to go ahead to the next slide, he also worked with artists such as Corot, Millet, and most notably Monet. He was surrounded by French Impressionists, but as I mentioned earlier, he was actually quoted as saying that a lot of the French Impressionists failed as draftsmen. And he knew that he painted with qualities of an Impressionist, but he didn't consider himself an Impressionist. And so he was also quoted as saying, "The painting that simply describes or obviously explains is not a work of art at all, in my opinion." And so this aesthetic romanticism that you're able to see in his painting is kind of the culmination of that thought of his, that if it perfectly displays nature as one sees, then it hasn't really achieved its job. And so on the left, you see wood gatherers at the edge of the forest, which is at the MFA in Boston, and then Millet on the right, a garden scene, and you can see these rich, dark colors and the beautiful kind of broken impasto technique that we also see with Anaking. So if you want to go ahead to the next slide, the McMullen's actually fortunate enough to have 2 paintings by Anaking. So if you'll look on the right, this is an autumnal river scene, and this is his later style. And so as you can see, his time in Europe really influenced him in the way of Monet and some of the other artists that we looked at. But unlike the kind of ethereal, light, airy brushstrokes of the French Impressionists, he was really, really compelled by the German school in particular, with a darker color palette and more rugged, dark strokes of his paintbrush. And so this aesthetic romanticism that you see in his landscapes truly conveys his love of nature above all else. And it was also a really great love of his, nature, I mean, because he was chairman of the Parks Commission of Greater Boston in the 1890s. And he was actually one of the ones that helped found the Boston Park System, which is kind of neat. So there's an Anaking Street in Boston named after him, and all of the work that he did civically in Boston. And so he was a man of many trades, and we are very, very thankful to have 2 of his paintings in the McMullen. So if you want to go to the next slide, I believe it should be our work again. And so I just want to close out quickly with a quote from the Boston Globe. In his obituary, they painted him as one of the world's greatest landscape painters and one of the most inspiring influences in the American world. So as I said, this is a really academically inspiring piece. It helps us understand the influence of French Impressionists, the German Royal Academy of Art, and how that influenced American painters like the ones that we're seeing today. So I think there's a lot more work to be done on this painting, but I believe my time is up. And so I will pass it on to Matt, I think.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Matthew DiBenedetto. I am a student ambassador here at the McMullen and a senior art history major at BC. So I'll be presenting today on Samuel W. Griggs' Rocky Coast, painted in 1866. So Samuel W. Griggs, a native of Roxbury, Massachusetts, was a prolific Bostonian landscape painter who achieved success in his lifetime. He is best known for his painted depictions of New Hampshire's White Mountains, views of Maine and the Massachusetts coast, along with depictions of Newport, Rhode Island, Vermont, Lake George, and the Adirondacks. Beginning his professional life as an architect, by 1854, Griggs had become a full-time artist, eventually working and residing at the studio building in downtown Boston on Tremont Street. As described by the New England Magazine in 1907, so after a few years after Griggs' death, the studio building, held the true bohemia of Boston, where artists and literati delighted to gather. So in 1855, Griggs exhibited at the Boston Athenaeum for the first time, and over the next decade, he had exhibitions there almost yearly. And beginning in 1873, Griggs also exhibited regularly at the Boston Art Club, of which he became a member. So Griggs often spent his summer in northern New England or upstate New York. In 1858, he journeyed to West Hampton, New Hampshire for the first of many seasons. He stayed at the same inn as several prominent New England artists, including Asher Brown Durand, William Tross Richards, and Samuel Gary. As part of his artistic process, Griggs would later work up his large final compositions from sketches he made on his summer trips. Later in his career, Griggs became proficient in still life, producing a number of fish and wild game pieces. And it would seem that Griggs left the Northeast only once, as indicated by his obituary. And that trip was in 1891, where he traveled to California and later exhibited a painting entitled Souvenir of California at the Boston Art Club. So little is known of Griggs' artistic training. However, some scholars have speculated that Griggs trained under Albert Bierstadt, the renowned Romantic and Western painter. Given the stylistic similarities in their paintings, Bierstadt is known for including an emulating glow from the most powerful aspects of the landscape, be it water features, mountain cliffs, or weather anomalies. A true romantic painter, and you could see an example of his work on the right there. So clearly Griggs is focused on less fantastical formations in his landscape, but he includes the same glowing quality nonetheless. And you could see that if you look at the cliffs on the cliffs and how the light is kind of beautifully being depicted as reflecting off of the waves there. So additional support for this claim can be found in the evidence of an existing relationship between these two men. In 1858, Bierstadt organized an exhibition in New Bedford, Massachusetts, at which Griggs showed 3 mountain paintings executed in New Hampshire that summer. So within the collection of Boston College since at least 1969, Rocky Coast, completed in 1866, affords no definitive indicators of this view's location. If that is, the location isn't imagined or by Griggs himself. Beginning in 1860, Griggs exhibited several views of the Maine coast, although none of the titles listed in the various exhibition catalogs suggest the dramatic oncoming storm of the Rocky Coast, painted in 1866. Yet the McMullen's painting displays a stylistic similarity, most notably if you look up between these two paintings at the depictions of the cliffs, to other paintings by Griggs depicting the coast of Maine. To add authority to this claim, I've looked through the museum's records and at least 5 appraisals, so the people who have come in and look at this painting throughout the 20th century have asserted that this view depicts a scene of the Maine coastline. So taking a second to just look a little more closely at the painting, you can definitely see that there's areas that are, especially the more dramatic areas of the landscape, that are really emphasized with this kind of glowing, beautiful light, as opposed to you see on the right, this kind of collection of dark storm clouds and a steamship sailing in the background. And there seems to be kind of a momentum shifting to the right. And I think that's emphasized, especially if you look very closely at the men pointing down there, you could see that I think there's definitely a movement that shifts right, as almost the clouds and waves are moving right. So we've been lucky enough. I want to say a special thank you to our assistant director, John McCoy, who's done some really great research on this Griggs painting. So in his own research, he had made a wonderful note that the completion of this painting was 1 year after the completion of the Civil War. So as John McCoy has put forward in his research, the question he asks is that, can we view this painting in the light of a post-war mindset? I think tellingly, the steamship, a side-wheeling frigate, so that's was a commonly used naval vessel in the Civil War, depicted in the background, is not identified as a merchant or naval vessel. With that being said, if it is a naval vessel, this vessel sails into a collection of dark storm clouds, which themselves seem to be moving right towards the border of the painting, retreating from the rays of sun, retreating from the rays of sun, beginning to dominate the composition. Now, can we argue? I don't want to look at this too. I don't want to look too deep into this painting, but I wonder if this painting is a romantic representation of hope for better times after the completion of the Civil War. And I leave that up to all of you to decide. So before we move forward, again, I want to offer a special thanks to the McMullen's Assistant Director, John McCoy, for some research that he's put forward on this painting last year. And if any of you are interested in learning more about this painting, John is part of an ongoing series on the McMullen's website, has published an interactive spotlight on Griggs's Rocky Coast. Essentially, you can scroll your mouse around and specific sections of the painted will be highlighted and they're talked about. So it's certainly worth a look. And thank you, and we'll move on to Chris now.
Hi there, everybody. My name is Chris Rizzo. And I will be talking to you. I'm also a student ambassador. I'm a junior art history major. And I will be talking to you about Frederick Bosley and his work held in our permanent collection, Peggy and the Bittersweet. So Bosley is a native New Englander, like many of the artists that we have discussed tonight. And he was born in Lebanon, New Hampshire in 1881 and resided in New England for the vast majority of his life. He was really a New Englander and a Bostonian through and through. Bosley began his lifelong pursuit of painting and the arts at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where he studied for 6 years under the great painters Edmund C. Tarbell and Frank W. Benson. You will note that you have seen one of Tarbell's paintings earlier in this presentation in Diana's portion. I believe it was the woman in the blue veil. The Blue Veil, forgive me for the incorrect titling there, and Benson, both of whom were closely also tied to Goodwin, who Ethan presented on earlier. So Bosley takes this time studying for 6 years under Tarbell and Benson, and Bosley showed rare talent and quickly became a prized pupil within the school, known for creating impressive portraits and other works. Bosley was awarded the Sears Prize in 1904, a prestigious award for young American painters, and was also awarded the Page Traveling Fellowship in 1907. Both of these scholarships or these awards allowed him to travel and study in Europe for a period of about 2 to 3 years, where he encountered a lot of the French Impressionist culture and Bosley really navigated the spaces of the traditional home of the Western art tradition. Again, interacting a great deal with Impressionist and Modernist works that were really coming into fashion around this time. Bosley returned to the United States after his time in Europe, married, and became a painting instructor at Abbott Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, and at Groton School. And then he was hired on as the School of the Museum of Fine Arts' painting instructor. So he ended up claiming the same job that was once held by his educators and mentors, Edmund Tarbell and Frank Benson. Bosley lived in Lincoln at his home Cherry Croft before eventually moving closer to the city in Concord, Massachusetts, where he lived until his death. But he always maintained a studio in the city, in the Fenway studio building, the same building that Hale and his wife had their studios in. So we're seeing this picture emerge of Frederick Andrew Bosley very closely tied in with many other figures of the Boston art scene. What's really interesting is that a lot of the painters that we're talking about tonight knew each other very closely. Personally, they may have diverted from each other in terms of their style and how they chose to paint, but they were all acquainted on some level, and probably acquainted with the collectors of the city. We mentioned the collection to Isabella Stewart Gardner in her museum earlier. Bosley worked mere blocks away from the Gardner and the Gardner Museum. So it is no doubt that he knew the towering figure that was Isabella Stewart Gardner in the early 20th century. So now to come to the work itself. Here in this picture, we see a beautifully rendered white woman dressed in a kimono and surrounded in the space by various sketches, paintings, some kind of works of art. The color categories of various hues of blue, particularly navy and royal blues, and orange or rose gold really lead our eyes around the painting. And our attention falls on some curious choices for subject matter. The kimono and the rose gold vase filled with the bittersweet blossoms create really orientalizing connotations. Orientalism, for those of you who don't know, is the notion of Western artists painting subject matter from Asia or from the Middle East with a Western lens. And so really, Bosley definitely falls into that narrative. So the subject matter in the center of the painting, the kimono and the vase, along with the bittersweet blossoms, makes those connections in our mind that Bosley may not have traveled to Asia, but we know from research done as a part of the Egomania exhibit at the McMullen Museum 2 years ago, that artifacts and art objects, large and small, had absolutely penetrated the Boston cultural scene by this time. The prints and paintings that surround Peggy create a marine motif of deep blues and shallow waters, removing us from the domestic scene that occupies our attention in this painting. Bosley paints the skin of this woman like it is porcelain, white as snow, guarding the blush and the shadow effects on the right side or on her left, our right side of the face. But Bosley really presents a kind of illusion of perfect whiteness and smoothness that we see so often in romantic, realist, or even Rococo works of art. Now, Bosley himself and how his philosophy penetrates this painting, Bosley was really a staunch traditionalist, going so far as to resign his position at the MFA in 1931 to protest the admission of modern art styles and modern art works into the curriculum and the collection of the museum. Bosley represents a blend of realist and impressionist styles in a changing world. And we can see that his style gradually becomes more and more outdated as time goes on. Not necessarily that his work becomes irrelevant, but he's no longer on the leading edge of artistic creation by the time of his death. So we see the broad brushstrokes in this painting combined with small detailed rendering of the face and elements of the vase that are really striving to render as much detail as possible. And Bosley really altogether rejects the impressionist color theory of opposite representing the real. And so Bosley still sticks with representing light, shadow, and naturalistic manners. Bosley was a master of interior spaces. The vast majority of the works of his oeuvre, if we could go to the next slide, Matt, the vast majority of the works of his oeuvre are painted in interior spaces, as we see here with in the studio and arrangement. And other works are the same. He loves portraits. He loves to paint living rooms and to really work out the geometry of walled spaces. So if we could go again forward one more slide, Matt. And as we can see in Peggy and the Bittersweet, the exact shape of the room and its three-dimensionality is uncertain. We do not have all the context, but the walls and the furniture have a beautifully rendered light and shadow contrast. And again, this is borne out in many of his other works. Thanks, Matt. So we can see, you can sort of see how there's a bit of a zigzag, but we don't exactly know, forgive my expression here, we don't exactly know which way it zigs and which way it zags. We need a little broader view to see all the context. So some other things about this work. Really in almost every work of art by Bosley, we can see and feel the influence of Tarbell and Benson, Bosley's mentors, both realist expressionist painters themselves, that straddle the line and resist certain tendencies of impressionism while embracing what it means to be a later romantic and to be a modern painter. Bosley never took to the outdoor subject matter and plein air painting, as was popular with the Impressionist and as was adopted to a certain extent by Benson and Tarbell. And he really never found the palpable thickness of a lot of later Impressionist works and works done by Tarbell and Benson. He doesn't take on that thick impasto brushstrokes that loads paint up on the work itself. But Bosley is still a fine American artist of the 20th century and a fixture of the American art scene in Boston and at the MFA. He influenced countless students that have, their works have also filled the Boston art scene and made it what it is today. So, and again, I would like to thank you all for coming. And I don't know if we're going to do questions or not, but I'll hand it back over to you, Diana.
I also want to say thank you to all of you. You've done a fantastic job, and we would like to open it up to questions at this point. I will remind you, if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the chat function, or if you would like to unmute and simply ask our presenters a question. I do have one already that I can share, so I will go ahead and give that to you. So this comes from Donna, who asks, other geographic areas have groups of artists known as a group, such as the Hudson River School, with particular characteristics. Is this group known by a name? And if so, what is it? And which artists are included, and what are the characteristics of their works? I know that we've touched on some of those things here, but maybe if there's a kind of succinct, perhaps, overview.
Are we talking about the Boston School here?
Yes, I think
so. The dominant figures of that school are, as have been mentioned both by me and Chris, Edmund Tarbell and Frank Benson. There was also another member, William Paxton, and then Philip Hale as well. There were a number of people in the school. It was known as the Boston School. It was criticized initially when they began painting because it was criticized by academic painters because of their sort of daring use of these newfangled impressionistic techniques. But then they became pretty much ubiquitous. And I think they achieved fame, and they basically dominated the Boston art scene well into the 1940s. More recently, the Boston School of Painters, which actually also included a number of women. There was a very interesting exhibition put forward at the Museum of Fine Arts, and I believe it was in 2001, called A Studio of Her Own, Women Artists of Boston. And that included Lillian Westcott Hale as well, who I mentioned, Philip's wife. So there were a number of women in this Boston School of Painters, but they have been criticized more recently because they focused on the lives of the upper classes. But that was partly because, and maybe not all these artists were necessarily wealthy, or they maybe middle class, as I mentioned, but most of their patrons, however, were real Boston Brahmin wealthy patrons. So they were often representing those classes in their paintings. But it would have been known as the Boston School. I think there was a whole group of painters that became known as the Tarbellites because they followed, I think maybe Bosley was one of those. I don't know, Chris, but anyway.
Bosley was absolutely a Tarbellite. He basically,
I like that.
The guy.
I like that term.
Yeah.
But anyway, I hope that answered your question. I don't know if it did, but.
Thank you, Diana. That was great. So we have another question by our own director, Nancy Netzer, who asks, do you have a sense if these artists were collected primarily by Bostonians or New Englanders?
Oh. Ooh, that's a tricky one. Any of my students know that? Any of the students here know that?
I can say definitively that a lot of Goodwin paintings are in New England more broadly, Boston, and particularly upstate New York collections.
Yeah.
And oddly, we at the McMullen have probably a handful of painters that are Boston and upstate New York have that in common for whatever reason.
And the New Hampshire school too sometimes. Philadelphia too. I think there's the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Some of the better painters, or the more main figures are represented there because they often taught there as well as at the Boston School. But I don't really know, collectors, private collectors, I think there are probably quite a few in Boston collections, but I'm not a scholar of this area, so I don't really know the answer to that now.
And then we have another question, actually from Sean, that's asking, when the museum will reopen now that the vaccines are arriving. And that is, I can field this one for us. We're all hoping as soon as possible, but we are with Boston College and the libraries as well, right now doing the best we can to also protect our students, our security, and our own staff and faculty that are working in the museum. But we assure you that we will let you know as soon as we reopen, and we're fingers crossed, hopefully in the next few months.
We do feel pretty confident that we'll be able to open with our fall exhibition of Rodrigo Mariano, which is a wonderful Cuban painter, and hope to open that in September. But as Rachel said, it really depends on so many things. Mm-hmm. But let's be optimistic that it might even happen before.
Yep. And then we have another question from Eleonora, who asks if we have any more information about the period that Anaking spent in Venice.
Oh.
Yes, so I am in the materials that I was able to find about Anaking on his grand tour in Europe. He didn't spend very much time in Venice, but he was very much so compelled by Venetian artists like Canaletto, and especially because of his seascape landscapes. And so he took a lot from them, and especially Canaletto, in his I think it's his view of the Grand Canal is a painting that I saw kind of name dropped in the articles that I was reading about him. He took a lot from his brushstrokes, from his, in Anaking's later works, you see the horizon line has dropped. It's gone back to a horizontal composition. And then he spent more time in Paris at the end of his career. So he started out in Munich because he had always been a bit more interested in the Royal Academy in Germany. And and then decided to end in Paris with the French Impressionists. And so he didn't spend as much time in Venice as he did in Paris, but he was definitely very intrigued by Canaletto especially. And so that's all I have on Venice. I don't know if anyone else knows any more than I do, but.
Okay, well, if there are any other questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or send it directly through the chat. We have a number of people saying that you've all done a fabulous job, and I agree. Since we do not have any other questions, I'd like to say thank you everyone for coming. We do have another Into the Collection taking place on Orientalism and expedition photography on April 22nd. I also encourage you to go to our events page to find a number of exciting events that are coming up that are always free and open to everyone. And until then, thanks so much, and we'll see you in the future.
Hey, Rachel, can I ask one question?
Yes, please. Absolutely.
Hey, it's Christy. I'm sitting across the country in my office in Glendale. And like one of the other observers, there was no museum in my day. And so it's great fun to watch the transformation and the buildup. And I'm so glad I got to catch this. So I actually disrupted my work to dial in, and then I couldn't tune out. So shooing people away. Terrific presentations. And I just wanted the students in particular to know that there's a great Tarbell, as you all know, really was so overshadowed by John Singer Sargent, in my opinion. And yet he was an incredible talent. And he did a life-size painting of Cal Coolidge, of course, the president, that hung for decades and decades and decades in the Algonquin Club at 217 Comm Ave. And I begged and pleaded with the new owners who were restoring that magnificent McKinley building and reopening it as the Quinn Club this spring, that they retain that painting. And I've been assured they have, and it's been restored. And it is a real treat. So I just wanted to throw that in, how much I enjoyed this presentation. And Edmund Tarbell also, I believe, while we're on trivia, was the first president of the Boston Guild, which of course, as you know, still operates. I see Chris Rizzo shaking his head. Do you know that to be a fact?
Yes, Tarbell and I think it was Benson, or Tarbell and I've been talking about him forever. Tarbell, thank you. They were first presidents together, and that was
quite wonderful.
The MFA.
McMullen could have a Tarbell if we could one day acquire a Tarbell. For our own
yeah, I actually never talked to Nancy about it, but I kind of had a secret agenda that if they discarded it, that we snatch it up and restore it from McMullen. But they assured me that it was going to be kept. And it's just a wonderful piece.
Oh, wow.
Anyhow, thanks so much, especially to students, but to all of you. It was just wonderful.
Thank you, Chris. I'm so glad that you were here. I know it's great to hear from you.
Cheers for now.
Bye.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you again at another upcoming event. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.